All right, so today we're going to be looking at one of the most important concepts in law, and that is jurisdiction. And understanding jurisdiction is absolutely crucial because it dictates where and which court has the authority to hear a case. And without proper jurisdiction, a court cannot proceed. It does not matter about anything, like the merits of the case doesn't even matter. Again, it won't move forward, okay? So, in the most simple terms, jurisdiction is the power or the authority of a court to hear and decide a case. It is literally the gatekeeper to the legal system. So, think of it like this: not every doctor, can perform every surgery. They specialize, right? Okay. In the same vein, not every court can hear every type of case involving every type of person. All right. And we're going to look at various types of jurisdiction and we're going to discuss like how they're established because again, it is absolutely vital for you to understand this because you will encounter it. And determining proper forum is absolutely crucial for resolving these disputes. So let's talk about the different categories of jurisdiction. And we'll start with the authority over the dispute itself. And then we'll move on to the authority over the people or the property that's involved. So, subject matter jurisdiction refers to the authority of a court over the actual dispute or the type of the case that's being presented. So, before a court can do anything else, it has to identify if it has the power to hear the specific subject matter of the case. Again, go back to the doctor analogy. Let's say that you have one who specializes in cardiology. Okay. They have subject matter jurisdiction over heart related issues, but not over anything else, not orthopedic, not dentistry, not anything else. Okay. So, like a small claims court, they have subject matter jurisdiction over disputes that involve small monetary amounts. Okay. But not over some sort of like complex corporate litigation or criminal case. Okay. So, some examples of subject matter limitations, like take family court. Family court will handle divorces, child custody, adoption, things like that. But it's not going to handle a criminal case. All right. Probate court is going to deal with wills and estates and conservatorships and guardianships. It's not going to hear a contract dispute between two businesses. Bankruptcy court is another, and it's specifically designed for bankruptcy proceedings. You have criminal court, which is going to handle, violations of criminal law. And you have to ask, like, why is this important? If a court, again, lacks subject matter jurisdiction, then any judgment it issues is void, okay, meaning it has absolutely no legal effect. This is why this is the first thing that has to be established. All right, so in personam jurisdiction or personal jurisdiction, this refers to the court's authority over the specific individuals or the parties that are involved in the lawsuit. So this is about whether or not a court can compel a particular defendant to appear and defend themselves in that court. And the key concept here is due process. So for a court to have personal jurisdiction, it has to be fair and reasonable for that defendant who's being sued to be brought into that particular location to defend themselves. And this is rooted in the due process clause of the U.S. Constitution. So how do we even establish personal jurisdiction? The easiest way is through their domicile. And a person's domicile is their permanent home and their principal establishment. So if a defendant is domiciled in the state where the lawsuit is filed, then the court generally has personal jurisdiction over them. For example, if John lives in Georgia and is sued in a Georgia state court, then the court generally has personal jurisdiction simply because Georgia is the domicile. We're going to talk about venue. Don't worry, but this is where the jurisdiction will then get a little more nuanced. Now, you have consent, and a defendant can consent to a court's jurisdiction. And that can happen explicitly, like, for example, by signing a contract that includes like a forum selection clause where they say, look, I agree to resolve disputes in a specific state. So, for example, if you have a contract between, say, a New York company and a Georgia company, and this contract states that any disputes will be litigated by New York courts, then by signing it, the Georgia court consents. I mean, not the Georgia court, the Georgia company, they consent to New York's personal jurisdiction. You can also have a another expressway is through an acknowledgement of service and waiver. This is typically done in our family courts. And in those cases, what happens is they will sign saying that they have received the paperwork and that they are waiving service for their particular court so that it can be in this particular, court. Now, that typically gets filed back with the court whenever there is the initial filing. Now, this can also happen implicitly, and that would be an example of by appearing in court and actively defending the case without actually raising an objection to jurisdiction. This is something that you would typically want to do at the onset of writing your response, like your answer, your motion to dismiss, things like that. You would want to put in there that there is an objection to the jurisdiction based on the lack of personal jurisdiction. You can also make it so that you can say, defendant is, not waiving any personal objections. They are simply willing to come to the court for a limited purpose in order for the court to determine whether or not jurisdiction applies. So then you would have a hearing to determine whether or not this court has the proper jurisdiction or not. If it does, it moves forward. If it doesn't, it gets kicked out. But if it does move forward, it has at least preserved your objection so that in the event that you need to appeal it, you absolutely have the ability to. Now, the long-arm statutes are state laws that will allow a court to exercise personal jurisdiction over an out-of-state defendant, but they have to have certain minimum contacts with the state, okay? So the minimum contacts have to be such that suing this particular defendant in that state doesn't offend the traditional notions of fair play and substantial justice. Hold on to that statement right there because we're going to come back to it. But let's say that you have a company that's an out-of-state company who regularly sells products or services in the state, right? And let's say that their defendant commits a wrongful act, like a car accident or something within the state's borders, right? So if the lawsuit relates to property that's owned by a defendant within the state, it of course makes it a whole lot easier. For example, if you have a driver, say from Tennessee, who causes an accident while doing business here in Georgia, right? Well, Georgia's long-arm statute would likely allow for the Georgia court to exercise personal jurisdiction over the Tennessee driver for a lawsuit that came from that particular accident, even though that driver isn't a Georgia resident. Now, remember I said we would come back to something about minimum contacts, and that brings us to International Shoe versus Washington. So to understand minimum contacts and the evolution of this personal jurisdiction, we have to look at the landmark case of International Shoe versus Washington. And this case fundamentally shifted how courts assess personal jurisdiction. They originally had a very rigid focus on a physical presence, and this case changed that. So International Shoe was a Delaware corporation within its, and it had its principal place of business in Missouri, but they had these salespeople who were employed within Washington state. And those salespeople who were residents of Washington, they displayed shoe samples and took orders of these shoes for customers that were in Washington, okay? But International Shoe didn't actually have any kind of offices or warehouses or like any kind of physical property inside of Washington, okay? So all orders were shipped from outside of Washington. And the salespeople's commissions were paid from Missouri, right? So the state of Washington sued International Shoe to collect unpaid unemployment compensation taxes. And Washington served the lawsuit on one of International Shoe's salespeople inside of Washington. But they also sent a copy of it by registered mail to the company's headquarters in Missouri, okay? So the question before the court was, did Washington have personal jurisdiction over International Shoe? They were a company that was not present in the traditional sense in order to collect these taxes. And the Supreme Court said, yeah, yes, they do have personal jurisdiction. Um, so this is where the court articulated this minimum contacts test, okay? And it stated that for a state to exercise personal jurisdiction over a non-resident defendant, that the defendant had to have the certain minimum contacts with that forum state, such that the maintenance of the suit does not offend those traditional notions of fair play and substantial justice. So the court found that International Shoe's activities in Washington, they had these regular and systemic employment of these salespeople. They had the solicitation of orders. They had the sales of shoes. Those all were enough to say that there were sufficient minimum contacts. Okay. So the benefits and the protections of Washington's laws were extended to International Shoe's activities there, making it fair for the company to be subjected to Washington's courts. Okay. So the significance of International Shoe was huge because it moved away from that outdated notion that a corporation had to be present or had to be doing business in a state in a very tangible and physical way. Okay. It established this flexible standard that was based on the nature and the quality of the defendant's contacts with that forum state. And it introduced that concept of fair play and substantial justice. And it emphasized that jurisdiction doesn't have to be, it can't be unduly burdensome to the defendant, but it has to be, and it has to be reasonable, okay? And this case laid the groundwork for modern long-arm statutes and the subsequent, development of the specific and general personal jurisdiction. So following International Shoe, the Supreme Court continued to define the boundaries of these minimum contacts, right? Especially in the context of products that were moving through the stream of commerce. This is where we have Worldwide Volkswagen Corporation versus Woodson. And this was a key case that illustrated the limits of personal jurisdiction, okay? So you have the Robinsons, and they purchased a new vehicle from Worldwide Volkswagen, and that was back in New York, okay? So Worldwide was a regional distributor for the New York area. Now, the Robinsons drove through Oklahoma on their way to a new home that they had in Arizona, and they were involved in a serious accident. Their car caught on fire, injuring the occupants. And the Robinsons sued Worldwide Volkswagen and its retailer, who was Seaway Volkswagen. And they did it in Oklahoma court, alleging that there was a product liability issue. Well, neither Worldwide nor Seaway had any kind of offices or sales or service operations or anything like that in Oklahoma. Their only connection to Oklahoma was that this particular car, which they sold in New York, happened to be involved in an accident there. Okay. So the question before the court was, did the Oklahoma court have personal jurisdiction over Worldwide Volkswagen and or Seaway Volkswagen? And the Supreme Court ruled that they did not. Oklahoma did not have personal jurisdiction over either of them. The court clarified that they called it a mere fortuitous circumstance. That this product was sold in one state, causes an injury in another state, and it wasn't enough to establish these minimum contacts, okay? So the minimum contacts had to arise from an act by the defendant themselves that would have purposefully availed the defendant of that particular privilege of, let's say, conducting activities within that particular forum state, okay? Then, in that particular case, it would be able to invoke the benefits and protections of that particular state's laws. Okay, but the court stated that for this particular defendant to be subject to the jurisdiction, like they had to reasonably anticipate being hauled into court in that particular state. And the defendants in that case, again, they had no contacts, no ties, no relations whatsoever with Oklahoma, nor were they trying to, serve the Oklahoma market. Okay. So the significance of worldwide was huge because it established the foreseeability test, but it had a kind of crucial nuance here, okay? Because it's not just about whether or not a product might foreseeably end up in a state, but it's whether or not the defendant purposefully directs its activities towards that state's market. Okay. And it reinforced the idea that defendants have they have to have voluntarily engaged in some kind of activity that connects them to that forum state. They have to be advertising to those people. They have to be putting products there. They have to be doing something that's connecting them to that state. Okay. And this case is the cornerstone for understanding that the limits of this specific personal jurisdiction, particularly when the product's liability case, for remote, manufacturers or distributors when it comes to the stream of commerce. So following International Shoe and Worldwide Volkswagen, courts continue to refine the minimum contacts analysis, especially in the context of contract disputes and national businesses. And a crucial case in this, kind of evolution was the Burger King court versus the Rudesiewicz. And it was decided by the Supreme Court as well. And so this case is particularly important for understanding personal jurisdiction when a defendant has no physical presence in the forum state, but it does have a substantial contractual relationship with a party in that state. Okay. So you have John Rudesiewicz, and I think it was his partner, but they were two Michigan residents, and they applied for a Burger King franchise in Michigan. Okay. They negotiated and signed a franchise agreement with Burger King, who was a Florida corporation headquartered in Miami. And the contract stipulated that the franchise relationship was established in Miami, that these disputes would be governed by Florida law, and that all payments were to be sent to Miami. Okay. So when the Michigan franchisees fell behind, they were kind of significantly behind on their payments, Burger King sues them in federal court in Florida, alleging this breach of contract. So Rudesiewicz argued that the Florida court lacked personal jurisdiction over him because he was a Michigan resident, and he had never even physically been to Florida in connection with the franchise agreement. So the legal question before the court was, well, did a Florida court have personal jurisdiction over the Michigan franchisees based solely on their contractual relationship with the Florida-based company? And the Supreme Court said, yes, they do. Okay, so the court reiterated International Shoe's minimum contacts test, but they added this critical element, and that was purposeful availment. Okay, and so a defendant had to have purposefully availed himself of this privilege, again, of conducting activities within the state, thereby, again, invoking those benefits and protections of its laws. So the court found that Rudesiewicz, through his extensive negotiations with Burger King's Florida headquarters, that his acceptance of this, Florida choice of law clause and the long-term structured relationship requiring that he send payments to Florida, that yes, he had purposely availed himself to the benefits of doing business with a Florida corporation. And so he entered into this long-term agreement that was all about this continuous and deliberate interactions with the Florida headquarters. Okay. So the court also said that once the minimum contacts are established, the burden then shifts to the defendant to show that the exercise of jurisdiction would then be unreasonable or unfair. Okay. So the significance of Burger King was that it clarified that a physical presence in the forum state is not always required for personal jurisdiction. Okay. Especially in modern commercial transactions. it emphasized the importance of a defendant's intent and their deliberate actions when it came to creating contacts with that forum state. Okay. It kind of underscores that a contractual relationship with a party in the forum state, particularly one where there are ongoing obligations involved, and you have that choice of law provision that those can be sufficient to establish, that purposeful availment. And that case is highly relevant, particularly in today's like digital age, where you have businesses that are routinely interacting across state lines without, a physical presence. So it helps to determine when, online commercial activity can then subject a defendant to the jurisdiction in a remote state. All right, so another important case regarding personal jurisdiction, particularly related to consent, is the National Equipment Rental versus Shue Kent. And that case clarifies that parties can, through an agreement, consent to jurisdiction in a specific forum. Now, in 1961, Shue Kent, who was the defendant, executed a lease with the National Equipment Rental. And it was for rental of farm equipment. And the document was a simple, like 1.5-page form lease that did have, it consisted of, 18 numbered paragraphs, right? And the final paragraph in the document assigned Florence Weinberg, an officer at National Equipment, as an agent for the purpose of accepting service under the agreement. Okay. Now, Shue Kent did not know Weinberg, but signed the lease indicating that he agreed with the terms. And so 1 year later, National Equipment ended up bringing suit against Shue Kent, stating that, Shue Kent had failed to make any payments on the lease. And so National Equipment served Weinberg with the summons and the complaint as the agent assigned to Shue Kent under the lease. And then Weinberg promptly notified Shue Kent of the service. National Equipment also notified Shue Kent, hey, Weinberg has accepted, service. So Shue Kent filed a motion to quash the service. And the district court granted the motion, finding that the agency's arrangement basically between Shue Kent and Weinberg was faulty. Okay. And the Court of Appeals affirmed it. And so the Supreme Court granted certiorari. So the issue was, can a party to a contract, can they appoint an agent to accept service of process under that contract, even if that the party has not met the agent and is not, the agent is not explicitly required, to convey notice to the party? And the answer was yes. Okay. And they said, a party to a contract can appoint an agent to receive service of process on their behalf. Parties to this contract, they have the flexibility to memorialize their intents. Okay. We have the option to contract for anything as long as it's legal, right? And they can agree to resolve disputes arising under the contract in, one jurisdiction over another through, the form of choice clauses, and even to allow an agent to accept service of process or even to just waive service outright. And so the court said basically, like, even if a contract clause doesn't obligate the designated party to inform the party of the service of process, the agency law itself dictates that if the agency does promptly inform the party that service has happened, then that act will validate the agency relationship. And in that case, the parties contractually agreed that Florence Weinberg would be Shue Kent's agent for the purpose of receiving service of process, and that Weinberg had fulfilled that duty by promptly, going to Shue Kent and saying that she had been served. Okay. So the court said there can be no due process violation. Shue Kent was given notice of the service, period. Okay. And although you have Shue Kent who argues that Weinberg has this conflict of interest due to her position as, his as his agent and also as an officer at National, um, it was considered too narrow to create a conflict. Okay. Again, because Shu Kent had been properly served and the holding was then, reversed and remanded. Now, there was some dissent on this particular case that I don't know. It depends on how you want to look at it. But like one of them was Justice Brennan. And he said that a printed form that is provided by a salesperson and signed by a consumer is not the same as a contract formed by a meeting of the minds. Okay. So the fact that Shu Kent had signed the form without anything more does not mean that he intelligently agreed to all of its terms. Okay. There was also Justice Black who also said, this holding is basically giving these large corporations free reign. Okay. Free reign in these unbargained for contracts with individual consumers. And they said that the majority's decision allowed corporations to include their boilerplate contract clauses that will require these individual litigants to travel these unreasonable distances at a substantial cost in order to defend themselves. And those agreements amount to a waiver of the litigants' constitutional rights. Okay. But he added that, it cannot be said that this waiver is knowingly and deliberately made because, again, it's required to, which actually I should say, which is required to make the waiver valid. Now, one more thing. Again, this case is an emphasis of the principle of freedom of contract, that we are allowed to choose forums for disputes. We're allowed to agree to anything so long as it's legal, right? But it does kind of highlight that fairness in these agreements does often hinge on whether or not the defendant has received actual notice and has had the reasonable opportunity in order to be heard. And that is a powerful tool for businesses that are conducting themselves, transaction-wise across state lines. Now, in rem jurisdiction means power over the thing. And this type of jurisdiction is going to give the courts authority over a specific piece of property where the property itself is the defendant. And the key feature here is that the lawsuit is about the property rights of everyone who has an interest in that property. Okay, so all persons with an interest in the property has to defend it. So, for example, quiet title actions. This is a lawsuit to determine the clear ownership of real estate. So the property is the central focus. You have admiralty cases, and those are disputes that are involving ships or maritime liens. So the ship itself might be subject to the in rem action. You also have forfeiture proceedings, and that's when the government seeks to seize a property that's used in criminal activity, like say a car that was used to transport, illegal drugs. So the property becomes the defendant. The distinction from in personam is important because with in rem jurisdiction, the court doesn't necessarily need personal jurisdiction over all the owners as long as it has jurisdiction over the property itself and then provides proper notice to any potential claimants. Now, your quasi in rem is a hybrid. It obtains jurisdiction over a person's property interest, but the lawsuit is actually about a personal claim against that person, not necessarily about the ownership of the property itself. So the key feature is that the property is seized or it's attached to satisfy a potential judgment against the owner. And it can be brought in any state where the defendant has any kind of assets. So let's say that you have John Doe, right? And he is a resident of state A. And he owes Jane Smith $100,000 in a contract dispute. Okay. John Doe has no assets in state A, right? But he owns a vacation home in state B. Jane Smith could potentially bring a quasi in rem action in state B, attaching that vacation home in order to satisfy her claim against John Doe. Because the lawsuit isn't about who owns the vacation home, but rather it's about John Doe's debt. Okay. So if Jane wins, then the vacation home could be sold to pay that debt. All right. Now let's talk about the um, modern relevance here. The use of quasi and rem has been significantly limited by the Supreme Court decisions. I'm going to tell you one next. But it essentially requires that there be minimum contacts between the defendant and the forum state, which is similar to the in personam jurisdiction, even when property is involved. And that makes it less common as a primary basis for jurisdiction today. Okay. But again, it's still an important concept to understand kind of historically and theoretically. So the case that I was just saying that I would touch on is Schaefer versus Heitner. And Heitner brought a shareholder derivative suit in Delaware against the Greyhound Corporation, which was incorporated in Delaware, and it was represented by Schaefer. And it was alleging that there were acts that took place in Oregon. And Heitner also filed a motion for an order of sequestration for shares of Greyhound stock that was owned by the individual defendants that were named in the complaint, who then moved to vacate the order on the grounds that the ex parte sequestration violated their due process rights, and the property that was seized was not capable of attachment in Delaware. And the court ended up rejecting this particular challenge on the grounds that the suit was brought as a quasi in rem proceeding. And I know I just said a whole bunch of words, but I hope it makes sense. This is traditionally, the quasi in rem, it's traditionally based on the seizure of property that's present in the jurisdiction rather than contacts between like the defendants and the state. And so in this particular case, the question before the court was, must there still be, sufficient contacts between the state and the interests of the defendants in the property that's seized before a court can exercise jurisdiction quasi in rem? And the court said, yes. They said quasi in rem jurisdiction can be exercised over a person only if the interest of a person in the things seized meet that minimum contact standard that was established for personal jurisdiction under international shoe. And which again, that established, that minimum requirements for exercising jurisdiction in a manner, I guess we can say, that was consistent with due process that was in the 14th Amendment. So if there was not minimum sufficient contacts as required by international shoe, then the Delaware sequestration statute deprived Schaefer of his property without due process. So that property was seized. It was statutorily located in Delaware, okay? But it didn't have any relation to the subject matter of the actual litigation. So the defendants had nothing to do with the state of Delaware. And their only connection to it was that they had accepted these directorial positions in a company that was incorporated in Delaware, okay? But accepting those positions, it didn't mean that they can be taken to Delaware courts, okay? And in the same vein, Delaware's assertion of jurisdiction over the defendants was deemed to be inappropriate, and the judgment was reversed, okay? And this is, I don't know about you, business organizations was one of my worst classes. Like, I hated business organizations, but it does have some relevance because, like, some of the concurring opinions, like, say, from Justice Powell, he said that the international shoe rationale should not necessarily extend to other forms of property, such as real property located within the state. You've got Justice Stevens, who says purchasing stocks on the open market where the purchaser may not know in what state that corporation is even incorporated is not a sufficient contact with the state in order to establish the jurisdiction, okay? And then you even have, You have Justice Brennan, who's kind of giving a concurring opinion and a dissenting opinion, because Justice Brennan says, hey, this international shoe standard should apply to this case. However, in accepting those jobs with this Delaware corporation, those defendants elected to assume powers and to undertake responsibilities that were wholly derived from Delaware's rules and regulations, which amounts to the sufficient context in order to justify the jurisdiction of that particular state. Now let's shift gears to federal jurisdiction and under the circumstances under which the federal courts can have jurisdiction. Because the federal court is a court of limited jurisdiction, which means that it can only hear certain types of cases. So federal jurisdiction is going to apply when federal law or the U.S. Constitution is involved, or when the U.S. is a party to a case itself, or there is what's considered complete diversity and a controversy in excess of $75,000. All right, so federal question jurisdiction. This exists when the primary issue in the case is based on federal law or the U.S. Constitution. And that means that the claim itself arises under federal law, okay? Now, there is a well-pleaded complaint rule that we have to discuss. So for a federal question to exist, the federal issue must appear on the face of the plaintiff's complaint, okay? It's not enough for a federal defense to be raised that plaintiff's core issue, like it has to be federal in nature. For example, if you have a lawsuit that alleges a violation of federal, like civil rights statutes, like discrimination under Title VII of the Civil Rights Act, you have a case involving a copyright or trademark infringement or patent infringement. Those are governed by federal law too. There are state ones. Don't get me wrong. We're not talking about that right now. We're talking about the federal aspect. A dispute over like the interpretation of, say, a federal environmental regulation. You might even have a state law that violates the U.S. Constitution. Like, say, you may have someone claiming that there is a First Amendment free speech challenge because the state law is somehow, infringing upon that, right? Now, sometimes the state law claim might depend on the interpretation of a federal law, okay? And in these types of cases, there might be federal jurisdiction, but it's kind of a more complex analysis. You can also have concurrent jurisdiction, and that's a really important concept because concurrent jurisdiction exists when two or more federal courts have subject matter jurisdiction over the same case. And that means that both federal and state courts might have the authority to hear the particular case. So, for example, civil rights claims can be brought in state or federal court. Also, you could also have, say, a bank robbery, which is a federal law and a state law. Now, the U.S. as a party is where things get interesting because federal courts have jurisdiction in these matters, and it doesn't matter if the United States government is a plaintiff or a defendant, but we have to talk about sovereign immunity. And that's because historically governments, including the United States governments, have been able to enjoy this sovereign immunity, meaning they cannot be sued without their consent. Take that in. I said what I said. Now, the U.S. government has waived its sovereign immunity in certain circumstances through specific statutes that allow individuals to sue the government. For example, the Federal Tort Claims Act. This allows individuals to sue the United States government for certain torts like negligence, as long as it's committed by federal employees. So like if you're injured by, say, a negligent, postal worker, then you can sue the U.S. government under the Federal Torts Claim Act in federal court without having to get permission first. Now, diversity jurisdiction is interesting. It's the type of federal jurisdiction that applies when all of the parties of the suit have different citizenship in a different state other than that of the opposing party. But it also has to have an amount in controversy that exceeds $75,000. Okay. And that's called complete diversity. And the primary purpose of diversity jurisdiction is to prevent potential bias against out of state litigants in state courts. All right. So the key requirement here, we're looking for that complete diversity. Okay. So no plaintiff can be from the same state as any defendant. If even one plaintiff and one defendant are from the same state, then diversity jurisdiction is defeated. So, for example, plaintiff A from Georgia sues defendant B from New York and defendant C from Georgia. Well, you can't have diversity because plaintiff A and plaintiff C are both from Georgia. Okay. But let's say plaintiff A from Georgia sues defendant B from New York and defendant C from Florida. Well, we have diversity so long as the amount in controversy is met. So it has to be above $75,000. Now, again, the damages claimed have to exceed $75,000, but it has to be without cost and interest. Okay. And it doesn't mean it's a precise number as long as it has the potential to be more than $75,000. Now, determining an individual's citizenship is going to be their domicile, and that's where they intend to remain permanently. Now, with corporations, a corporation is considered domiciled in 2 states, and that is the state where it's incorporated and the state where its central business is conducted, and that's its nerve center. And the nerve center is typically where the corporation's high-level officers are directing and controlling and coordinating, the corporation's activities, right? So let's say that you have a company, we'll just Acme, okay? And it's incorporated in Delaware, but its headquarters and primary decision-making are in Georgia. Then it's a citizen of both Georgia and Delaware for diversity purposes. So when a case is initially filed in state court, but the federal jurisdiction exists, whether it's through a federal question or through diversity, then the defendant may have the right to remove the case to federal court. And they would do so by filing a petition for removal to change the jurisdiction of the case, which that petition would essentially be asking to change it from state court to federal court, where, it's pending in state court, and asking the federal court to accept it in. And the petition would have to outline the basis for federal jurisdiction, like saying a diversity of citizenship. Now, if the plaintiff believes that the case was improperly removed to federal court, then they can file a motion to remand, asking the federal court to send the case back to state court. And that happens if actually, I should say it often happens if the plaintiff argues that complete diversity does not actually exist or that the amount in controversy has not been met. Now, beyond the main categories, there are other important aspects related to where a case can actually be heard. So, as mentioned under diversity jurisdiction, a corporation has 2 places of domicile for jurisdictional purposes. Again, it's state of incorporation and the place of business, which is the nerve center. Okay. And the Supreme Court adopted this nerve center test to determine a corporation's principal place of business. That, again, is where the corporation's high-level officers are directing, controlling, and coordinating the company's activities. Now, it's usually the corporate headquarters, but it's not necessarily where most business is conducted or like where manufacturing takes place. For example, you may have, like, say, a major car manufacturer, and they may have factories in many states. But its nerve center, which is its principal place of business, is, again, where its executive decisions are made. That's going to be where our nerve center is. So the concept of the corporation's principal place of business for diversity jurisdiction was clarified by the Supreme Court in the Hertz Corporation v. Friend case. This is what established that nerve center test. So you have these individuals who sued the Hertz Corporation, alleging some issues with wage and hour laws. And Hertz was incorporated in Delaware, but this case, again, it was in a California state court. And Hertz wanted to remove the case to federal court based on diversity of citizenship. And Hertz argued that its principal place of business was in New Jersey and not California. Thus, diversity was created. So the plaintiffs argued that Hertz's principal place of business was actually in California because a significant portion of its revenue and its operations occurred there. So the question before the court was, what is a corporation's principal place of business for the purposes of diversity? And so the Supreme Court said unanimously they adopted this nerve center test for determining that principal place of business. And they said that it's the place where the corporation's officers direct, control, and coordinate the corporation's activities, which I know you've heard me kind of harp on that already a couple times. But that is typically the headquarters for the corporation. And the court reasoned that that test is more simple, more predictable, and easier to apply than other tests that looked kind of at the volume of the business or the location of the operations. So it was meant to avoid this complex kind of multi-factor inquiry into where the place of business is. Now, the significance of Hertz was that it provided this clear way for determining the corporation's principal place of business for diversity jurisdiction. And it ended that use of that total activity or any kind of other multi-factor approach that led to some uncertainty in litigation. So now, for diversity purposes, again, the corporation is a citizen of the state where it is incorporated and the single state where its nerve center, which is usually the headquarters, is located. And that makes it easier to determine if complete diversity actually exists. Now, I told you we would get to venue. So while jurisdiction determines which court system, like state or federal, and what type of court, like bankruptcy, probate, whatever, can hear a case, venue determines the specific court within the judicial system where the case is brought. And venue rules are designed to ensure that a case is heard in a location that is convenient and fair to the parties. And it's usually related to the domicile of the parties or the subject of the lawsuit. So, for example, if you have two individuals from different counties, but they're in the same state and they have a car accident in a third county, right? The lawsuit could potentially be filed in any of those three counties, depending on the state's venue rules. I can tell you that here you can have it so it's typically filed where the defendant's domicile is, okay? Unless, again, they happen to waive it. Another thing is if you have somebody where maybe you have two defendants that are in the same state with the plaintiff, and then maybe you have some out-of-state defendants. With the in-state, you would then file in either one of the defendant's locations. Again, unless a waiver has been secured. Now, if a case has been filed in a wrong venue, then a party can file a motion to transfer venue to a more appropriate location. That doesn't mean the court lacks jurisdiction, but simply that it's not the most convenient or the legally designated place. So forum nonconvenience is a legal doctrine that allows a court to dismiss a case or to transfer it to another court, even if it does have proper jurisdiction and venue. The court, though, has to determine that there is a more appropriate or convenient forum for the litigation to take place. And in these cases, courts will consider various factors like the availability of witnesses and evidence, the convenience of the parties, the public interest in having the case heard in that particular forum, the relative ease of access to sources of proof, the enforceability of a judgment. The list goes on, but this doctrine prevents plaintiffs from forum shopping, trying to find a court with the most favorable laws or procedures, even if it's inconvenient for the other parties or the court itself. All right, so this is the last one, and it's about establishing jurisdiction. So when someone is faced with a legal dispute, lawyers have to go through this systematic process to determine where to file the lawsuit. So the first question is, Where did the actual basis for the suit occur? That is going to help determine if a court in that location would have personal jurisdiction over the defendant, which might be through the long arm statute, but it also helps with the venue. Then you have the second question, which is who are the plaintiffs? What is their domicile? And that, of course, is crucial if you might have a diversity jurisdiction issue. Then question three is who are the defendants? What is their domicile? Again, essential if you're talking about, diversity jurisdiction and personal jurisdiction. Question four is are any of the parties corporations? If so, where are they incorporated? Where is their principal place of business? That nerve center. And again, vital for determining the corporate citizenship in the event that it's a diversity suit. Next question would be, does this suit involve a federal law? Is this core claim based on a federal statute or, U.S. Constitution? If so, then we're looking at federal question jurisdiction. Will the party, will the United States be named as a party? If so, federal court is the more appropriate forum due to the U.S. government's involvement. Is there a common state of domicile? So if any plaintiff and any defendant share the same state of domicile, then of course federal jurisdiction is generally defeated. But, just kind of to recap, I can't stress enough that jurisdiction is a very, very crucial concept. It is about understanding the foundation of the court's authority. Remember that the subject matter is the authority over the type of case. The personal jurisdiction is the authority over the parties, and it is established through domicile, consent, or long arm statutes. And that would go back, in case you need to look at any of the cases, refer back to like International Shoe, because that's really kind of where it began. But you can see it through Worldwide Volkswagen, Burger King, and the National Equipment to get an understanding of what it means for, minimum contacts and purposeful availment, things like that. Then you have the in rem and the quasi in rem, which is the jurisdiction over the property. And again, that is the authority over the thing, that interest, or the property interest to satisfy a personal claim. Again, you have the federal jurisdiction, which is where federal courts can hear cases where there's a federal question, the U.S. is a party, or there's diversity citizenship. And then, of course, you have the process of removing a case between state and federal, and that's your removal. And then, of course, you want to get it back in, you remand it back down. And then last but not least, corporate domicile and the distinction between jurisdiction and venue include the importance of things like forum selection clauses in these corporate contracts, okay? And that's really kind of it. I mean, just remember that jurisdiction, again, it's absolutely super important. It's going to dictate the proper forum for dispute resolution, and it can be a critical kind of early battleground in litigation, especially if somebody's fighting it. And that's it. Let me know if you have any questions. Bye.